Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. This is the third lecture in a series of lectures over Chapter 1. This is Chapter 1C, and we'll be talking a little bit about some of the basics of science and the nature of behavior analysis. So let me start with just a quick summary of the characteristics of behavior analysis that they describe in your textbook. The first is that there is a focus on behavior. Specifically behavioral excesses and behavioral deficits. In other words, behaviors that occur too much or behaviors that don't occur enough. Typically, behavior modification is guided by theory and as well as by the philosophy of behaviorism, which means that our interventions are based on basic behavioral principles that have been established in the laboratory. The emphasis is on current environmental events. We, as behavior analysts, consider ourselves to be strong environmentalists, that many of the causes of behavior can be identified in the environment. And we look specifically at what are called antecedents and consequences. In other words, those events and stimuli and prompts and cues that occur before a behavior happens, and those consequences that come as a result of the behavior itself. So the outcomes, if you will. When we use the word consequence, we're not talking about punishment, we're talking about just the changes in the environment that are the direct result of behavior. It's also the case that the procedures and variables within behavior modification are very clearly defined and described. Our treatments and our intervention procedures are very, very well defined and clearly described. Our dependent variables, or the behaviors that we're studying or that we're modifying, the behaviors that we're measuring, are very clearly defined. And whatever our treatments are also clearly defined in terms of being the independent variables. So our independent and dependent variables are described, as well as any of the conditions under which the treatment occurs. There's no real emphasis, pardon me, with my cursor, there's no real emphasis on the long-term past because it can't be measured. So although we know that the long-term past can have some influence over our behavior, unless it can be measured directly, we don't typically include it in our behavior modification interventions. Another characteristic of behavior modification is that we reject any hypothetical underlying causes. So we don't place blame on things that we can't see or measure. So, for example, explanatory fictions, when we ascribe someone's behavior to their personality. Well, personality is really just a description of the behavior that we're trying to explain. And so we don't use personality or personal traits as underlying causes, just like we don't usually rely heavily on physiological variables. Physiological variables so we don't usually say, well, it's part of their genetics or it's part of their biology, unless you can be very specific and measure what those contributing factors are, which behavior modification people don't usually go inside the organism. We don't usually take blood samples or DNA tests. And so we basically avoid any underlying hypothetical causes that aren't measured directly. And then finally, it's important to remember that the treatments that we're talking about, although they can be used by professional behavior modifiers, they're also used frequently by regular folks in everyday life. And so these treatments are often implemented by people just like you and me. Okay, so I just want to cover a few important details. I want to talk just a little bit about determinism. I want to talk about why the way we use language matters. I want to talk about a word that I really like. It's the word contingency and the role of contingency. Within that, we're going to talk about the ABCs, the very basics of behavior. It's also known as the three-term contingency. We'll talk a little bit about some of the myths of behavioral psychology, something I like to call the error of reification, and then we'll just tie up a few loose ends. So let's talk about determinism. Basically, determinism states that behavior has specific causes. Behavior happens for a reason, and that causes come before effects. So when we talk about science, we talk about cause and effect, and the cause comes first and then the effect. That's really important for us in terms of the scientific method, because our goal is to manipulate what we think is the cause and see whether or not it has the desired effect. Without determinism, you can't have science. So we have to, as behavior modifiers, we have to assume that the cause comes first. The cause of behavior lies in our past. Outcomes of our behavior affect the future occurrences of the future probabilities and the future occurrences of our behavior. Outcomes can only strengthen or weaken future behaviors. They don't change the current behavior. So let me give you a quick example. I call this the pop machine example, and I ask students, why do you put money in a pop machine? And they often will answer, to get a pop. And that's the way we usually speak in our everyday language. But if you remember that cause comes before effects, then you can't put the cause in the future. So I don't put the money in to get a pop in the future. Instead, I put money in the pop machine because in the past, when I've put money in a pop machine, I've gotten a pop. Or when I've seen other people put money in a pop machine, they get a pop. And so I have built this relationship between the behavior of putting money into a pop machine and getting a pop out of it. So when I'm thirsty, I see a pop machine, I have money in my pocket, I put the money in the pop machine. And that behavior is strengthened for the future if I get the pop. What happens if you put the money in and you don't get the pop? Well, you probably first kick the machine, maybe you do a little bit of swearing, but you'll probably be a little bit less likely in the future to put that money into the pop machine until maybe you see someone else being successful, or until you see that the repairman has come to fix it. So consequences have a big impact on behavior, but what they do is they follow, we do a behavior and we get a consequence. Something happens afterward. And that consequence, the consequence of our behavior, helps to determine whether we will repeat that behavior in the future. Here's what B.F. Skinner said. If we're to use the methods of science in the field of human affairs, we have to assume that behavior is lawful and determined. We must expect to discover what a man does is the result of specifiable conditions, and that once these conditions have been discovered, we can anticipate and to some extent determine his actions. Now, I want to also talk about language and language precision. It's very important to be precise with your language whenever you step into the role of scientist or scientist practitioner or behavior analyst. Lazy language can lead to really bad science, and that can result in ineffective interventions. Unless we're very, very clear and very, very precise about what we do in terms of an intervention, we could find that people are interpreting things differently and doing things differently and either having or not having success with interventions that we feel are valid. We have to be careful not to fall into several common traps. For example, here are just some examples of familiar language traps. One is confusing the words reinforcement, rewards, and bribes. Those three things are not the same. Reinforcement occurs immediately after a behavior. And it's a consequence that happens immediately after your behavior. And typically we define reinforcement as an improvement in the individual situation. So they receive something that makes their situation better. You get the food, you get the girl, you make the money. So whatever it is, you're getting something that makes your situation better. Rewards, on the other hand, are not defined by the person receiving it. A reward might be defined by the person giving the reward. And what I offer to you might not be as valuable as what you would choose if you could choose your own reinforcer. So rewards are defined by other people, and sometimes they're either the wrong type of consequence or the wrong kind of reinforcer, or even something that you don't like. If I said that I'm going to give you a reinforcer, I'm going to give you chocolate every time I see you for coming to class, some of you might drop my class if you're allergic to chocolate. So that would be a reward for coming to class, not reinforcement for coming to class. Oh, and then there's also the question of bribes. Many people criticize behavior analysis because they say that we're bribing people to do things. We're bribing children to do their homework or their chores. But bribes are very specifically defined as things of value delivered before the behavior occurs. So a bribe would be, I'm going to give each of you, I'm going to give all of you $25 to come to class every single day. And I'm going to give it to you today. And when I give it to you today and say that this means you have to come to class every day, there's no guarantee that you're all going to come to class. Some of you might get sick. Some of you might have something come up. Some of you might just sleep in. Who knows? So a bribe is not a reinforcer because it comes before the behavior. Reinforcers come after the behavior. Rewards are not reinforcers because they're defined by the giver, not by the receiver. Reinforcers are always defined by the receiver because if they don't change behavior, if they don't increase behavior because they're valuable to the person, then they're not reinforcers. So it's very important that we be very precise in our language. We're going to be talking about reinforcement, and I probably won't talk much about rewards or bribes because they're not very effective in changing behavior. The other thing, I mentioned this a little bit previously, but consequences. Many people, many parents will refer to consequences as punishers for misbehavior. Child will misbehave and the parent will say, well, you're going to have a consequence. But consequences just mean that it's something that comes after the behavior. It could be a reinforcer or it could be a punisher, but the nature of a consequence is defined by the individual. And so it's not, when I talk about consequences, I'm not talking about punishments. Instead, what I'm really saying is that those events that happen immediately after the behavior occurs. So if you knock on a door, if someone opens that door and says hello, that's a consequence. That's the consequence of you knocking. If you stood in front of the door and did nothing, that person would never open it. But if you knock on the door will open and someone will greet you. That's a consequence. All right. Let's talk a little bit about a particular term, the term contingency. Contingency is a wonderful word, especially if you're playing like Hangman or Words with Friends. And it refers to a causal or a dependent relationship usually between a behavior and an outcome or a consequence. In other words, the behavior produces the consequence. It's a cause and effect relationship. The behavior is the cause and the consequence is the effect. And when you have that kind of relationship between a behavior and a consequence, we say that what you have is a contingency. The outcome depends on the behavior. If I eat a meal, I'm satisfied, I'm full. If I put my key in the ignition of my car and turn it, my car will start. The starting car is a consequence for turning the key in the proper direction or putting the correct key into the ignition. So we use this word in a variety of ways. I'll talk about, over the course of the quarter, you'll hear me talk about behavioral contingencies. You'll hear me talk about the three-term contingency or reinforcement contingencies. And what we're really talking about is this relationship between behavior and its outcome. Now, this leads directly to the ABCs of behavior. And I like the term ABCs of behavior because they actually refer to the things that are important in behavior. A stands for antecedent. These are cues or prompts or situations or certain stimuli in the environment that prompt your behavior or increase the likelihood of your behavior. A good example are traffic lights. When you see a traffic light, it turns red, it increases the likelihood that you will stop. If it turns green, it increases the likelihood that you will go. And so there are the cues in the environment. Seeing a policeman, the likelihood of stopping at a stop sign goes up. The stop sign is good, but a policeman near the stop sign is even better. And then those are followed by our behavior. It's our actions, the actions of the subject or the participant that is prompted by that antecedent. So, an example is if I'm in a 3rd grade class, I can, and I want to get the student's attention, I can clap. And then the kids will do it back for me. And it's a very common kind of prompt to get everyone's attention. Now, the consequence is what comes immediately after the behavior. A stimulus or a change in the environment, maybe a reinforcer is delivered or maybe a punisher is delivered. When I clap like that for students and they clap back, then the teacher will frequently say, "Thank you. I'd like your attention so I can talk about the following activity that we're going to do." So they get a consequence that comes after where they're thanked for their behavior. So you can probably think of many times during the day when you receive consequences for your behavior. The more immediate they are, the more effective they are. And so the A for antecedent, B for behavior, C for consequence. Typically, the behavior analyst looks at this little kernel, the ABCs of a particular behavior, to really understand the purpose of the behavior. What is the behavior responding to, and what comes immediately after the behavior helps you to understand why the behavior is happening. All right. We also sometimes call this ABCs of behavior, you'll hear it referred to as the 3-term contingency. And the terms are the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So this is the same as the ABCs of behavior. You have A here in the diagram. I'll use my little cursor. You have A for antecedent leads to B, which is the behavior, which leads to C, which is the consequence. All right, couple of myths. We talked a little bit about this, and now they're actually written up here in detail. So myth number 1, rewards and bribes are not the same as reinforcers. Some people think that they are, but they're not, and it's a myth that they are. Reinforcers are typically defined as being defined by the recipient. So something you would work for, something that you like, something that makes you want to do that behavior again to get more of whatever that consequence is. It's usually contingent on a given behavior after the behavior occurs. So the reinforcer is delivered for the behavior occurs, the consequence happens, it's contingent on the behavior causes it, but it only comes after the behavior has occurred. And typically when we talk about reinforcers, they increase behavior in some way. It may increase response frequency, you may do it more frequently, it could increase magnitude, you may do it more forcefully. Or it may increase the probability that you'll use that behavior again. So when given a choice, that behavior might be the one that you choose. Rewards, you'll see, are defined by the giver, not by the recipient. And so they may not affect behavior. I might give you guys chocolate for coming to class, but some of you may not like that, and so it doesn't serve as a reinforcer for you. And then bribes are defined by the giver. So I decide what I'm going to give you, and I give it to you before the behavior occurs. So there's no contingency. There's no relationship between the behavior and the bribe. The bribe does not guarantee that the behavior will occur. And as a result, it may not increase response frequency or magnitude or probability. It may, but there's no guarantee that it will. And so reinforcers are not considered strengthening behaviors if they don't strengthen behavior. So then if they don't strengthen behavior, then they're not reinforcers. Another myth is this medical myth model that many of us, especially people in our society today, this erroneous view that all human behavior is just a symptom for some underlying physiological or psychological or medical or neurological condition, that everything is determined by what's inside of us. And So what this view says that the behavior that we see is caused by these underlying conditions. It's caused by our genes. It's caused by our hormones. It's caused by our ADHD. It's caused by our medical condition. And the behavior is really considered, under this model, behavior is really just considered a symptom of what's wrong with the individual on the inside. And so it's not really worthy of direct intervention. You don't have to worry about intervening to change the behavior. You just have to go in and fix the person. So people who don't want to get out of bed, who lose jobs, who cry a lot, we often label it as depression. And so we don't really try to change the behaviors. We try to change what's going on inside the organism by giving them prescriptions for depression. The idea is you fix the underlying dysfunction and the behavior will go back to normal. Now, as a behaviorist, I avoid this approach because it often leads to first of all, it leads to the wrong causal factors. Something is causing our behavior to be something that we don't want. Something is changing our behavior so that we're misbehaving in some way. But if I assume the problem lies in you, then I have no control over the environment. It stops the search for the real environmental causes. What are the things that have led to this depression or this misbehavior? How do we decrease that? We know that exercise and social engagement are very important to relieving depression. But most people think that the way you get to those is to give up a drug. The behaviorist would say, you need to we're going to work to get you up out of bed, and we're going to have you interact with other people as part of your treatment. And what you'll find is often the depression will lessen. It will alleviate to a certain degree if you get someone up and engaged in their daily life. So we avoid this approach because it leads to wrong explanations for why the behavior is happening in the first place. It stops us from searching for those real factors, and it can actually leave people without treatment. I worked at an elementary school, and there was a young girl that had some pretty severe behavior disorders, very disruptive, very argumentative, attention-seeking, and sometimes even aggressive. And I offered to bring in some graduate student specialists, behavior specialists, to help with her behavior during the day. And the teacher's response was, this is a brain-based behavior. There's nothing we can do about it. And so his assumption that the problem was inside of her gave him the freedom to do nothing about the behavior. And it was very sad to see. So I'm hoping that my students won't go down that road. Behavioral psychology is very optimistic because we deal specifically with the behavior and we don't blame behavior on the individual. And this leads directly to something that I call the error of reification, which is basically circular reasoning. When we see a set of behaviors, we often give it a label. And somehow that label becomes a thing. So for example, my depression example, someone has, they don't engage in social behaviors, they cry a lot, they don't want to get up, they lose a lot of jobs because they don't go to work. And so you put all those together and you say, oh, that person probably has depression. And now they actually have a thing. It's like a thing that's inside of them. Other examples are things like self-esteem. Do you have a good self-esteem or do you have low self-esteem? Self-esteem is not a thing. It's a label for behaviors. Self-concept, the ability to recognize yourself in a mirror, or the realization that you are an entity. And that becomes a thing. And it actually, self-concept is something that's supposed to grow in children so that they have this idea of a self-concept by the time they're 2 or 3 years old. And then finally, this label becomes the cause of the problem behaviors that were used to develop the label in the first place. So, for example, we use behavior to determine whether someone is shy or warm or introverted or extroverted. And then we explain their behavior by blaming it on the label that they're an extroverted person or an introverted kind of person or a shy person or a gregarious and friendly person. Those are really just descriptions of the behavior you're explaining. You haven't explained anything. You've just gone in a big circle. And then there's also things like cognitive characteristics. Someone's smart or gifted or dull and not very bright. But those really are descriptions of behavior. And so it doesn't help me understand behavior very well when I'm told, well, why did Marcos do so well on the test? Well, he's really smart. Well, how do you know he's smart? Well, he always gets really good grades on his tests. Well, how does he do that? Well, it's because he's really smart. Well, how do you know? Well, because he has a high GPA. And you see, we just keep going in a circle. And so from a behavior analyst perspective, we should avoid this circular reasoning and look for the real causes of behavior that we want to change. Okay, just a few loose ends here. This is the last slide. One, awareness. Cognitive awareness of our behavior. Now, it's not really necessary to assume that the client or the subject is aware of their behavior, of the causes of their behavior, or of the intervention. We're easily tricked by our brains. We are fooled by our brains, and there are many things that we do of which we're not aware. We're not aware of a lot of things, and some things that we're aware of are not true. So we kind of avoid the awareness thing. So when I say, why did the rat press the lever? Some people would say, well, because he knows he'll get food. It's that, why did you put money in a pop machine? Because I know I'm going to get a pop. Well, I don't really know what you know, and I'm assuming that a rat doesn't actually know that a pellet will come out of the machine the way we know that a pop will be delivered. And in fact, it isn't really necessary for us to know whether or not they know anything. Most behavior can be modified without the subject really understanding all of the details of why the change is happening. I'll tell you a quick story. My professor, Dr. Edmund Fantino from the University of California, San Diego, when he was a graduate student, he tells this story to his students every year. He said, when I was a graduate student, I participated in an experiment. And so I just signed up for an experiment and I went to participate. And so they put me in a room and they sat me down and they gave me some instructions on how to respond on the computer. And I worked on it for maybe five or 6 minutes. And after 5 or 6 minutes, I had the whole experiment figured out. So I opened the door and I went out and I said, excuse me, you probably are not going to want to use my data because I've figured out what's actually happening here. And the researcher said, oh, well, could you explain it to me? And he said, well, when the green light comes on, I have to press keys on the left-hand side of the keyboard at a very rapid pace. And then after a little while, the light turns red. And when it's red, I need to not respond at all. But if it turns blue, then I respond really fast on the right side of the keyboard. If I do this the right way, then I get points. They start to add up. And the researcher looked at him and said, you don't need to worry too much. Just go ahead and finish the experiment because that's not what's happening. So sometimes we think we know what's going on and we don't. So being aware isn't a prerequisite for behavior change, as it would be, for example, with Freudian psychotherapy, where you have to have insight. The therapist's job is to give you insight into all of this hidden information in the unconscious of your mind. So we don't need to worry about awareness. It's really not crucial. Later, we'll talk about instructional control, and a lot of people are very good at following rules. If they're told this is a rule, they'll follow it. And if they're aware of the rule, then they'll follow the rule. And so that is a treatment technique, but typically speaking, awareness is not a prerequisite for behavior change. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of parsimony. Parsimony is the idea that the simplest theory that addresses the most aspects of behavior or behavior change is preferred to one that has lots of assumptions or exceptions to the rule. So we like simple. We like simple, straightforward, and broad. So with parsimony, we avoid unnecessary principles and assumptions and concepts as much as possible. It doesn't mean that theories are always simple, but what it does mean is that when you are offered two explanations that account for the same behavior, the simpler one is the preferred alternative. And that's true in all sciences, that we seek parsimony. We seek the simplest theory possible, and the most elegant theory is the one that explains a lot about behavior with as few concepts or assumptions as possible. All right, so that's it. This was a little bit of a long lecture. I apologize. We have one more lecture for Chapter 1, and then the lectures for Chapter 2 and 3 are a little bit shorter. Okay, have a good day. We'll talk to you later.